Kelly, tell me a little bit about how you came into the Park Service.
Well, I originally started off working as an employee of a partner organization with the National Park Service when I was in my early 20s, and I quickly realized that I just fell in love with the parks and with the whole idea of the service and everything else, and and I ended up more or less going to grad school and then entering into a program where I could become a ranger and a student at the same time. And that was sort of that's the really short version of my entry into the Park Service.
Well, that's great. And where have you been? You mentioned to me a moment ago you had been at Yellowstone.
I have. I started off at Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which is located right on the southern tip of Lake Michigan, about an hour outside of Chicago.
Yeah.
And I went from there to Yellowstone. I was at Yellowstone for a couple of years, including during the winter. and Then from Yellowstone, I went to Golden Gate National Recreation Area, just across the bay from where we are right now in San Francisco. And then just this past April, I switched from there over here to the 4 Park Service sites that are in the East Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area, which includes Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site, Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park, Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, and then John Muir National Historic Site.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here today. On Yellowstone, one of the things I and my students have been interested in on the question of the snowmobiles in the winter. And in general, we look at kind of the early debate almost exactly 100 years ago, should you allow automobiles into Yosemite? And that whole question of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Do you have any insights on that kind of question? You were there in the winter?
Yes, and in the interior. I was based at Old Faithful, so I got to see a lot of it firsthand. I think my only insight is that amazingly, they seem to be closer now, from what I'm reading, to finding a good balance between folks who really want to make use and visit as much as possible in the winter, and then those who want to be mindful of protecting the fragile resources during that really stressful time of year. So they seem to be really getting close to finding a balance that works for most interests, both in terms of the business interests in the what we call the gateway communities there at the park, West Yellowstone, Cody, Jackson Hole to some degree, not as much as West Yellowstone though. So I think that in the Park Service, this constant preservation versus use dilemma is one that I think we're always going to be struggling with. We were given a dual mandate in that regard by the Organic Act. And so I think to some degree on a park by park or site by site basis, we're always going to be trying to figure out the appropriate balance for making sure that we allow the public as much use as possible, but without risking the protection of the resources that we're charged with doing. So yeah, it can be really interesting. I definitely will say though that being at Yellowstone during that particular time, in the middle of this past decade, was a really good opportunity to get a good sense of all sides of the issue. I will be honest, I went there and I was very, very pro wildlife and kind of anti snowmobile, and I soon realized that it wasn't really as simple an issue. I mean, when you're an employee yourself living in the interior during the winter, the idea that, that of banning snowmobiles entirely, every now and then you like to get out and say go to the doctor or buy groceries or something along those lines. And I also started to see that the way that animals that interact with snowmobiles versus snow coaches, which are supposed to be the more environmentally friendly alternative, was a little different. And so I started to understand the nuances of the situation and the complexities in a way that I would not have understood before I moved there. So I definitely left Yellowstone with a much better understanding of all sides of the issues, and felt like I was a little more neutral in some ways than I had been when I first came, with a lot of ideas that didn't really quite match up with the reality on the ground.
Do you feel that between the snow coaches and the snowmobiles, that one is more park friendly than the other? Or?
I think that's a really difficult label to try to attach. I personally have seen that, when you take bison, for example, a person on a snowmobile is still smaller than a bison. Bison are massive creatures. And when a couple of, say, 3 or so snowmobiles come by, the bison may be in the middle of the road and they kind of look at you like, oh, okay, you're like a little herd of these tiny machines, and they're not really bothered by you. And you can kind of skate by them on snowmobiles, and it doesn't really seem to bother them that much. However, when one of those bigger coaches comes by, that's what will actually make them get up and move off the road, because those vehicles are bigger than they are, and so they're more intimidating. So I think it really depends on the perspective that you're taking. From that particular perspective, it's more disruptive and more risky to the bison to have to get up and move and expend that kind of energy during the winter. For a snow coach, than it might be if you had a little fleet of snowmobiles going by that they didn't really care about. So, but that's just one parameter that you could look at in terms of being park friendly or, in favor of protecting the resources. There's many other aspects to it. So I think it's a very complex situation, and it's very difficult to generalize because what's good for the bison may not be good for some other aspect of things. So it's like, again, it was the kind of thing that I had a very sort of black and white view on when I came to the park, and as I understood the nuances better, my understanding became more profound of just how complex it really is.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping this winter to get down there myself and to do one or t'other. And I'd been thinking coach, but I've been thinking, well, maybe I should
go. The beauty of coaches are that they do transport a lot of people at once. There is that mass transit sort of aspect that is more environmentally friendly. But again, it just kind of depends on, and that's why I think it's difficult to say that one thing is better for the environment or for the park than the other, because again, what's better for the bison may not necessarily be better in terms of the impact to the roads, or, certainly snowmobiles have been the vehicles that they've had the most problem with going off roads and damaging some of the thermal areas in the winter. So again, there's so many sides and aspects to it that it's really difficult to generalize.
Are the snowmobiles required to have a guide?
They are now, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It sometimes doesn't prevent occasional issues. It just means that they're a lot less frequent than they used to be.
One of my themes, and I've developed a talk called The National Parks, the International Perspective, which is what I'll be delivering in Taiwan. And I love it because I can move different elements in and out very easily with the new technologies and so on. But one of my themes is the way animals are treated and different approaches to animals and access to animals. And one of my favorite parks so far is the Galapagos, where you are with every boat that goes out you don't sleep on the islands. You need a guide to go out, and it's and the guide is a naturalist, and partly making sure you don't misbehave, but also knowing a lot. So I kind of like the idea of the guide being part of that.
And I think even the guiding companies have warmed up to the idea as well. Certainly, I think that. And you have to understand, too, there's kind of a whole culture out in that part of the Rockies where folks are very independent. They have their ATVs, and a lot of households actually do have their own personal sleds, is what they call it. Snow machines or sleds are usually what they call snowmobiles out there. And a lot of folks do have their own, and they really, just kind of balk at the idea that they can't go in on their own. But guiding has been the biggest factor that has made a huge difference in a lot of the issues that we used to have, just in terms of, not just in terms of resource protection issues, but also in terms of visitor safety, because the guide companies can make sure that everyone is wearing the proper winter gear when they're getting on the snowmobile. I mean, beforehand you had a lot of accidents, you had a lot of, aside again from resource damage, you had a lot of safety incidents, and from frostbite to folks flying off of sleds that weren't being driven properly and all kinds of stuff. You had a lot of those types of incidents years ago, and those have really dropped off. Again, it doesn't prevent issues, because every now and then you do have some, but because of the guiding requirement, it's really dropped a lot, and law enforcement's been very happy with that as well. And even the companies have realized that they have to employ guides, but they can also charge more for these guided tours than if they were
pass it on to just
renting a sled. So I think a lot of the companies have actually been able to really maximize take that particular requirement and use it to their advantage, even in terms of some profit stuff. So, certainly it's just a different way of doing business, and it took them a few years to sort of adjust their business models to it. But like I said, from what I've been seeing, it sounds like they're getting closer to a compromise than they have in the last 34 years, which is really quite something. So.
Part of the fun of teaching the national parks is that there are these constant issues that are continually being redefined. I mean, once you decide you will let a car in, well, of course, in the early days, as I'm sure you know, that people just parked in the meadows up in Yosemite and camped right beside their car.
There's some really bizarre photos of Old Faithful back in those days too, with cars parked almost right up to the geyserite, at the base of the geyser.
Well, I can admit my first exposure to those parks was about 60 years ago, traveling across the country with my parents, and I don't think safety was quite as good there. People were falling into the pools.
They were. In fact, there's a really excellent book written by the parks historian called Death in Yellowstone.
That's funny. Everywhere I go, that book is for sale.
And they just came out with a new edition, I think, in the last month or two. So Lee did. He redid his last edition.
Well, in fact, I want to leave you with my a reference to my my website, blog site. In fact, my most recent post was called "Danger in the Parks," and I take the position that there's something we almost cherish the idea of danger in the parks. It's part of the idea of wilderness. We don't want it to happen to us, but
right. But we don't want to feel too safe either.
That's right. I guess that's it.
There is something to that, probably.
Yeah. Speaking of danger in the parks, this, of course, is a historical park, and I'm sure you haven't had anybody fall into a geyser here or be
that
trampled.
I can say. We've not had anyone fall into a hot spring here. However, this park is not without its hazards as well. We have fruit trees, which attracts lots of stinging insects, and we have Mount Wanda, which is a good chunk of land that's just to the south of the highway that feels a little more wild. It's kind of more classic California shrubland and oak woodland. It actually is a place that John Muir very purposely did not develop when they were developing kind of the orchards for a lot of the rest of the property. They could have ranched and they could have grazed livestock up there. Certainly the inhabitants before them had, but Muir opted to keep that area undeveloped simply because it was sort of a favorite sanctuary of his around here in an environment that was otherwise very developed with fruit orchards and things. It was sort of his little piece of as close to wildness as he could get close to his home, and he loved to take his daughters up there and hiking and taking a break from riding and just kind of getting away from the operations of it.
It's funny, I'd never heard that.
Yeah.
And I'm very pleased to hear it because another of my interests, well, within general environmental history is Henry David Thoreau. And they have an annual conference back there in Concord to honor him and read papers on him, and I've become sort of a devotee of that, as well as the pond itself. But one of the questions I play with myself is the question of who really was more deeply ingrained in the wilderness, exposed, Thoreau and Muir. And 99 people out of 100 that know anything about it will say, "What are you talking about? We're talking Yosemite versus this little pond."
Well,
but go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have when they come here about John Muir is that they associate him as this kind of nature nut, this long-haired, bearded guy who walked and lived off of nothing and tramping all over the Sierras. And certainly he did do that. But I think most people don't understand that when he wasn't doing that, he also had a family back here and an entire orchard operation. In fact, he literally took a break from more or less from traveling for about 10 years and lived here after his in-laws passed, really kind of running the orchard operations. And a lot of folks find that very hard to reconcile with their idea of Muir as this incredible, this wild wilderness man.
Yeah.
And it was also Muir, the businessman, who lived in this really well-to-do Victorian house up on the hill. And it's one of those things that I personally revel in because I don't believe that being a wilderness advocate and being a businessman necessarily are mutually exclusive ideas.
Sure.
Muir certainly didn't find them so. And really, when you take a look at what he accomplished and how he did it, it was the financial security and the social status that he gained by marrying to this very wealthy family and having this sort of social prominence that enabled him to accomplish what he did in the sense of being able to be a wilderness advocate, to have the freedom to write. After those 10 years spent here on really kind of focusing on the fruit ranching operations, he actually brought in his own family to help run things and his wife and kids, and then he would go off on his trips and do a lot of his travel. But he wouldn't have been able to do any of that were it not for the successful operations here that were literally funding him and supporting him while he did. So it is one of those things where you look today at how polarized some of these ideas have become, the idea of business versus environmental interests, and Muir would look at that and just scoff because he was into both.
Yeah. Well, and so many of those early backers, like Stephen Mather, were wealthy businessmen who
Ken Burns did an excellent job in his film series, really pointing out that the movement that really got the parks established was very much an upper class white male movement. It was. It's true. I mean, I don't think that it does any disservice to the Park Service to acknowledge that was part of our beginning.
Yeah.
And that is, and those people were very powerful people. Back then, they had all of that social and political power. And I'm grateful that they did what they did. But let's be honest, Muir would not have been able to be quite as effective as he was in terms of being an advocate for parks and for preservationism, were it not for his social standing and the financial security that he had to be able to pursue those things.
Yeah.
Now, he made a name for himself before he married, but he certainly married.
Did he do
well.
a lot of the writing right here?
He did. In fact, when you go in the house and you take a tour of the house, there is an area upstairs. It's Muir's study, and we call it the Scribble Den because he called it his Scribble Den. Okay. And he didn't do all of his writings here, but he did a lot of them, and certainly even some of his earlier writings from some of his field studies, he ended up compiling and editing them in that very room in this house. So we are literally the place where a lot of that work happened, which is house. Because you can just imagine Muir sitting there for hours.
Oh my,
writing, and his wife bringing up a tray or something along those lines.
I'm looking forward to photographing that and sending it out to my students. Is what you need to do.
Yeah.
Not that they're already pretty good at it.
They were, but yeah, he this was very much home, and he would go off on his trips, and he certainly left his heart in the Sierras on more than one occasion. But this is where his wife and his daughters were too, and so it's a side of him that many people never really thought or knew existed. And so I think a lot of folks, when they leave here, they leave with this more full understanding of who the entire person of John Muir really was.
Yeah, I hadn't necessarily thought of that. I actually wrote an essay myself on Muir. It's part of a book I wrote called American Realities, where the premise is that it's a background to a textbook in U.S. history, but it's more intimate. It chooses a particular Puritan woman and her death in childbirth for studying Puritanism, and the bombing of Hiroshima for World War II. But for environmentalism, the essay's on John Muir. And so I'm kind of familiar, I am familiar with the story. So to me, that's not a surprise that he was here and farming and writing. But it's very valuable to realize that the average person coming is thinking of the Muir of the mountains. And,
yes.
And it's important to know sometimes you have to do different things at different times in life to make things happen that you want to have happen.
Absolutely, and I think it really is a good way to recognize the fact that, especially back then, the environmental movement was an upper class movement. You had to have certain needs that were met so that you had time to focus on other things.
Yeah.
And it's a little, to some degree, I would argue that has still been the case. And I think if you look at the history of a lot of the major environmental organizations, you'll notice that they have tended to sort of be middle to upper class mostly white movements.
Yeah.
That has changed, and there are several prominent minority, non-white, environmentally minded organizations, especially around the topics of environmental justice. But the history of the environmental movement in this country is very, very much, it's a really interesting study to look at who has been involved in that movement and why, and who has been left out of that movement and how that's happened. And the founding of the parks is no different. But I think that certainly the socioeconomic aspect of who was in a position to be advocating for parks back then is something that a lot of folks just didn't really think about. They didn't really think about the fact that, in order to be able to wander through the woods and eat berries and, live off of whatever and not sleep outside, that you didn't really need much to do that. And maybe that's true in terms of, today's camping endeavors, but in terms of having the leisure time to do that, because you didn't need to worry about making money to support your family because other folks were working on that and running that for you. That's the socioeconomic aspect of it that most people don't ever stop to think about.
Well, and if they do, I love the Ken Burns film. That's that, and do you know the book that goes along with it? That's our textbook and the film, each with each assignment they have.
I will admit, I drove my husband crazy when that film first came out because I wanted to watch that opening, the very first episode with that opening sequence of the sun coming up over Hawaii volcanoes. I made us watch that at least a dozen times. My husband was finally just like, "Can we move on? I'm sick of this."
Oh, it's so
like, sorry, honey, we're gonna have to go take a helicopter ride when we go.
It is so evocative. Yeah, I was there. It's funny. I was there last spring, and another kind of theme I'm thinking of is parks that change. You're going to go and you see the view over the Snake River, the Grand Tetons. Obviously the weather changes, but you'll all see it. But I went to Hawaii volcanoes knowing I was going to go out in a boat and watch the lava cascade into the ocean, and it wasn't. And of course, you can't walk up to the lip of the volcano. And
no.
What I saw was still quite wonderful. It was at sunset. Once it's dark, you see on the clouds and above the major volcano there, you see the reflection of the red. So that's, but Ken Burns kind of set up some expectations that, though I guess if you were to go back right now, you'd find some real live lava flowing
You
along.
would, though probably not as picturesque as what he captured. I would agree.
Yeah, going into the ocean is certainly a great part of that.
Yeah.
Well, this business of wealth in the parks is, it is interesting, and I think it helped that not only were there people with great fortunes, but that land was relatively cheaper. I sometimes think I wish that a few of the Silicon Valley billionaires had an obsession for parks, but even then the land would be more expensive to acquire, and of course a lot of the greatest stuff is already in the park system, thank goodness.
That's true, though there is still a little bit of it going on today. Not very much. You're right. We're not really in a big acquisition phase in the Park Service. And usually most of what does get added is like small bits onto existing units.
Yeah, which can
little
be
parcels
valuable,
here and there, more or less. But no, and one thing I do have to say, though, is I don't want anyone to misconstrue my comments and think that I'm being anti-wealthy or something along those lines. I mean, there was a lot of, back then, there were a lot of examples of these philanthropists who literally just, like you said, purchased wide swaths of land and then more or less were able to work through the process and give it to the United States government to preserve. And, they didn't have to do that. Certainly there were many of their contemporaries who weren't doing anything like that with their fortunes.
Right.
There were lots of men who had the ability to have some leisure time like Muir who did not dedicate themselves to what he did. So I don't want to undermine their contributions. It's just that I think it's really useful today, especially to put them in their proper social context and to recognize that it was their particular influence, the influence that they had was what enabled them to accomplish what they did. Certainly men like John D. Rockefeller are unparalleled in terms of just the sheer amount of land that he bought and donated to, and it's now Park Service land, is staggering. Half of Grand Teton National Park, basically, today.
That's amazing.
And he wasn't the only one. So I don't want anyone, I do think that those folks are worthy of being celebrated for what they did do, because they were definitely men ahead of their time in that regard. And Muir's no exception, even through his writings. He may have been within this upper echelon of society himself, but I can't help but feel, he very much is very clear in all of his writings that he wants everyone to enjoy these places. And I think he would really be pleased if you were here today that such a greater swath of the American public really is enjoying these places. So, we have to give them their due. I think it's important to understand the social context that they were operating within, but I also think that it's important to realize that what they were doing was not something that just anyone was doing at that time. Well, there's always been sort of like the perceived good species and the perceived bad species. That's, you took a look at the way that, the history of wolf management versus the history of bear management, and you see that. If anything, I would argue that bears are more dangerous, a lot more dangerous than wolves.
Yeah.
And certainly there have been a lot of, say, livestock kills and other things that are attributed to wolves where they probably weren't necessarily wolf. But, wolves were outright exterminated in many parts of this country just because they were viewed as bad predators. And bears were never really quite viewed that way. Even when people would have, and there hasn't really been in the Yellowstone ecosystem since they reintroduced wolves, there's not been a single human-wolf confrontation that has resulted in anything but photos being taken. Or, well, sometimes the wolf being shot. But you see my point. Like, no wolves have attacked any people in the Yellowstone ecosystem. The same can definitely not be said about bears. Yet people continue to love bears. It's one of those things that doesn't really make sense logically. But there's this sort of idea that bears are these lovable animals that they can do all the damage that they want. And people are still going to look at them with an eye that is different from how they look at wolves.
I have a companion course to the National Parks course called The History of the American Wilderness, and we start with the film Never Cry Wolf. Do you know that story? And
I do.
And so right from the start, we love the wolves.
I personally love wolves, but that was another one of those things that I started to understand the other side of when I was in Yellowstone and understand the complexities and how for a rancher, they don't have to lose any cattle to have their bottom line affected by, when cattle are stressed out enough for just by the presence of wolves in an area, they won't put on as much weight. And so you can take those same cattle to market and lose thousands of dollars because the cattle don't weigh as much because they're too stressed out to put on
Wow, I
weight.
had never heard that.
So
No.
when you look at it that way, it's like this is literally, even if they don't lose a single animal, it can hit them in the pocketbook and hit their bottom line in a really significant way. So that was another perspective that I went out there and I was a complete and utter environmentalist at the exclusion of anything else, and I got a really good balanced perspective learning about some of the other aspects of
Yeah,
of
those
these issues.
conversations are so important, aren't they?
And they're often very
Yeah.
difficult, but I think that it's important to really be able to understand all the different sides and understand that these people are not just these, right-wing crazy people, that they have really good reasons why they feel the way they do. And once you stop and listen to them and listen to them explain
Yeah.
it to you, then you start to appreciate just how tough a situation it really is to manage these animals.
And there's a
sometimes.
fair amount of that where I live with, with coyotes, and we're beginning to get a few wolves into eastern Washington. You
Yeah,
probably know
coyote-
the slogan, shoot, shovel, and shut up.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody do that. But
Yeah, I personally would be more worried about coyotes than wolves. Coyotes are a lot more adaptable, and they are very smart. In Yellowstone, before wolves were reintroduced, coyotes had actually adapted their behavior just within a few generations to be able to hunt in packs. I mean, coyotes, you usually think of like the lone coyote or maybe two of them, and typically the prey that they eat is things like, mice and voles and maybe some rabbits and some slightly bigger things.
Yeah.
But no, they were actually hunting in packs and taking down deer and even some small and sickly elk,
Yeah.
which you do. I mean, and I my undergraduate focus was on animal behavior, and you don't typically see that kind of behavioral change as an adaptation that an animal is able to make. I mean,
Yeah.
wolves are pretty hardwired. They can survive on their own for a little while if they have to, but they very much need large tracts of land, and they need to hunt in a pack to bring down large prey. They're not very adaptable for long periods of time, whereas coyotes can go up and down in terms of they can survive on what foxes eat, or they can literally change their behavior and start hunting like wolves. I mean, it's really, if you take a look at some of the studies of what coyotes were doing in Yellowstone
That's
before wolves were
impressive.
reintroduced, it's
Yeah.
really quite something.
Huh.
Coyotes are fascinating animals, and so I think coyotes are like the cockroaches of the dog and mammal world. Whatever happens, they will find a way to
they'll
survive.
survive. They'll be there.
They can survive in cities, and they can
That's
survive
amazing, yeah.
in city, supremely urban environments, and also completely wild environments. They're just, I'd be a lot more worried about those coyotes than about the wolves.
Okay, well. Back to John Muir.
Anyway, back to John
Back
Muir.
to John Muir again. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I made my first ever trip to Hetch Hetchy. I'd written about it, and I won't say it was quite there with the Holocaust in Germany, but it just felt like one of the really sad moments in American history. And I went up there, kind of feeling, what is this going to be like, and did visit it. And I had, before going there, I'd always thought that, Muir lost that battle, but then again, we've got the park system today, and that became, instead of what we do from here on, it's there've been some exceptions, but for the most part, we haven't done, and we've not done anything quite that horrific. But I'm just wondering about, do you have any sense of how that affected Muir? Did he, in his last years, I know it was very hard on him, just even fighting it, whether or not win or lose, but do you think he died feeling that the park system wasn't going to work? Since that was the last big battle he fought and he lost it.
Muir, I think that Muir was a very optimistic person in a lot of ways. Whenever I read his writings, it's hard not to get that sense from reading his writings. But I think even he was supremely affected by that. I honestly think that he probably went to his grave still being very, very, it didn't happen that long before his death at all. It was within a couple of years of his death. And I think that he probably was fairly discouraged, but I think that's only because he probably couldn't see at the time just how Hetch Hetchy would turn out to be a completely heartbreaking loss, but it was more of a loss of a battle. And to be honest with you, I think there's a very good argument for the idea that had Hetch Hetchy not been lost, and Muir's death following so soon afterwards, if you look at the timing of all these events, it's not a coincidence. And I think that in some ways that the movement to create an agency to manage national parks, to protect national parks, to prevent tragedies like Hetch Hetchy from happening again, that movement gained strength in the aftermath of losing that battle. And certainly when Muir's passing then also added fuel to that. And then it became not just about preventing another Hetch Hetchy, it became about honoring Muir's legacy.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that it was really very easy. I don't think it would have been easy for Muir to have seen how that was all going to play out. So I think he probably was very discouraged towards the end of his life. I mean, his wife, he traveled a lot, but he was very lonely the last few years of his life. His wife preceded him in death by I think about 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
And his daughters were grown with their own families, and he lived in that house up on the hill alone for many, many years towards the end. And I can't help but feel that it must have been very discouraging for him in those last couple of years. But I think that because of how things happened, I think if somehow he's able to know what did happen afterwards, I think that would take some of the sting and some of the hurt out of what that was, because it may have been overall, looking back, a battle in this larger effort, but for him it was a very personal loss.
Yeah.
And he took it very personally. So yeah, I agree. I think he probably was very upset, but I also think that it's very possible that the movement to create an agency to safeguard national parks in the preservationist ethic that Muir so espoused, I think that movement might not have caught fire were it not for losing Hetch Hetchy and then losing Muir.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's hard to. I mean, I think historians now would look at it that way.
Yeah.
I think Muir at the time probably didn't really have a sense of how that was going to turn out.
Well, I hadn't thought of connecting those two quite to that extent, but that is a good point.
Yeah, and it's very, I think, much on our minds here at John Muir National Historic Site, because this Christmas Eve is the 100th anniversary of Muir's passing. And we're less than 2 years out from the centennial of the Park Service. And so I think we are very much becoming aware that, the timing of this is not really, I can't see that the timing is coincidental. I think that Muir's passing, as well as the Hetch Hetchy loss, ignited a
accentuated
that otherwise might have needed more of a spark to get it going.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think in his experience, what the new thought for me being at Hetch Hetchy was that not only had he lost Hetch Hetchy, but as far as he was concerned, he maybe lost the whole battle. That these parks that were supposed to be so sacred were not necessarily going to be exempt from future attacks.
Right, but again, he couldn't see the future to know that Hetch Hetchy would become a rallying cry.
That it was a triumph, really.
Yeah. In the end, it was a heartbreaking battle loss, but it enabled us to actually win the war overall. But again, when you're in the midst of the battle, you can't really see how the war's going to turn out. Where it's going
to go. Yeah, that's true.
So I feel very bad for Muir sometimes when I think about what those last couple of years must have been like. But I'd like to think that if anybody later on somehow had a sense of how things happened after he left this earth, I think if anybody has a sense of it, he probably does.
After our conversation, Ranger English and I walked back toward the park headquarters. Along the way, a little boy, seeking information to earn a junior ranger badge, approached her with some questions. She had just been discussing parks with me, a university professor, but now, without missing a beat, she talked about John Muir with a grade schooler. He asked her what Muir's advice to him might be. Her answer made me realize what had been apparent throughout our conversation. That John Muir's legacy is alive today, not only in the geology and biology of the parks, but also in work of rangers like Kelli English.
I think John Muir teaches us that everyone should love the earth. No matter how big or small you are, you can make a difference in protecting it.